Welcome to Books and Brews Light, number 67. We are here today with Frank S. Joseph from just outside D.C. with a very interesting story about Chicago and some interesting experiences in D.C. too. So welcome, Frank. How are
Thank
you
you,
today?
Laura. I'm so happy to be here.
Wonderful. Start by telling my audience a little bit about yourself and the
Sure,
books you'll be, talking about. Swallowed
sure.
wrong.
I am the author of the Chicago trilogy, of which this is book 3, To Do Justice, and the other 2 are sitting right next to me. I am a Chicagoan by birth, but I left Chicago in 1920. I'm sorry, 1929. Oh boy, I'm old, but I'm not that old.
You're
I
a
left
time traveler.
left Chicago in 1969, where I'd spent the first 29 years of my life vowing never to set foot in the city again, a vow that lasted a year or two until my grandmother was dying and I went back to see her. Um, and all that is part of my story, but we're here to talk about the novels and my life, really, because these novels are, the raw material for these novels is my life. My first 29 years in Chicago and its suburbs. And these are historical novels. They are about, this is the elevator pitch, they're about blacks and whites, Christians and Jews, how children view the world, conflict and forgiveness, and Chicago at mid-century, a great city going up in flames.
How much of these were inspired by your life? You were a journalist
Oh,
at the time.
100%, 105%, something like that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So,
This is fiction. I,
mhm,
I rush to caution you. These are stories. These are meant to be enjoyed as tales, and perhaps learn from. Uh, they are. I think of them kind of as being, what if my life had been this instead of that? Uh,
mhm,
because novelists are in the position. We play God. We can do whatever we want.
yes.
We,
Mhm,
the page is ours, the story is ours, and we stand or fall on how good the story is. And we're entertainers. That's all we are, nothing more. Uh,
mhm.
and we're here to keep your attention with great writing, great stories, and maybe a little something else extra here and
Right,
there, and a twist or two.
right. And these books are based around the 67 riots in Chicago.
The third novel, To Do Justice, takes place in summer of 1965 and summer of 1966 during the riots, the street riots, mostly on the west side of Chicago, which I covered as a reporter for the Associated Press. And the second novel, going backwards, To Walk Humbly, is takes place over about 5 years in the mid-50s, from about 1952 to 1957. And the first novel, To Love Mercy, takes place over 5.5 days in June of 1948. And your readers may wonder what the titles come from. And the titles come from the Bible. They come from the book of Micah, chapter 6, verse 8. What doth the Lord require of thee? To love, to do justice, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with thy God. The religion plays a big role in these novels. I don't consider myself a very religious person, but I am extraordinarily interested in the role of religion in society. I grew up in the south side of Chicago, which was at that time, in ways it isn't anymore really, but was at that time viewed as the most segregated city in America, north or south. Sociologists wrote about it. It really was.
Now, can I interrupt to
Of
ask? I
course.
find it interesting that a city in the north was considered one of the most segregated.
I hope I'm
Was
not. I hope I'm not misstating about that. I read
Mhm.
this statistic a long time ago, and it might have been of all cities in the north. But honestly, my recollection, I shouldn't assert these things without checking them before I assert them. But I do believe, even more rigidly segregated than, cities north and south. When when I was, when I was a child in the 40s, Chicago was experiencing a huge migration up from the south, of Black people, because their lives were not too much better than when they'd been enslaved. And in the north, the economy was booming. There was a war on. Factories were going 24/7. Chicago, most particularly. And so, Blacks came up by the hundreds of thousands. And when they got there, they found they really only could live in one place. There were one or two other places on the west side, but most of them were just crammed into this neighborhood that became known as Bronzeville, which is about 3 miles long and half a mile wide or so on the near south side. And the more, the reason, I'll just go into a little bit of the law here. The reason was something called restrictive covenants, which were private agreements between two parties, landlord and tenant, but they had the force of law. In a word, what they could do is allow landlords to discriminate based on race or whatever else they wanted to discriminate. And so every place else in the city of Chicago, they did. They took advantage of these restrictive covenants, and they didn't rent to Black people. But in Bronzeville, they did rent to Black people. So this neighborhood became progressively more and more overcrowded. The schools deteriorated more and more. Crime became more and more of a problem. And it was just, it was kind of a pressure cooker. So restrictive covenants were outlawed by the Supreme Court in 1948 or 1949, I forget. After that, Black people who lived in Bronzeville who wanted a better life started moving out. And almost the neighborhood closest to them was the neighborhood where I grew up, Hyde Park and Kenwood, about 30 blocks away. And so starting around 1950 or so, the first Black families started moving in on the eastern edge of Hyde Park.
And that was after the Supreme Court struck down.
That is correct. That is correct. Okay. And gradually, moved east toward the lake. And the second novel really is about, about the racial change. It isn't just about that. It's about a lot of things. But, it starts off with the racial change that is taking place in Hyde Park in the early 50s. So I think I'm bouncing around here, and I'm a little
bit. What is the story of the first book? And I believe the first and second books relate to each other. Does the third book also?
They all relate to each other, but I can't tell you how the third book relates to the second and first books because it'll be a spoiler.
Okay.
But I'll tease you with it. The first book covers about 5.5 days in June of 1948. It starts with the White Sox. It ends with the White Sox. And the way it begins is this white family, the grandfather, whose name is Nate, and the father, whose name is Charles, and the son, who's 10 years old at the time, whose name is Steve Feinberg, Jewish family. They go to a White Sox game, and it runs into extra innings, and they get out late. And they park the car in a private parking lot, which, people make their property available for ball games and charge money for it. And the car is the last car in the lot, and they're walking across to the back of the lot in the dark. And this group of Black children, 10-year-old kids, little bitty kids, couldn't really do any harm at all. Just sort of materializes outside, in the dark, and starts dancing around them and begging for dimes. And, in the dark and in the confusion, an accident happens, and one of the kids winds up on the ground unconscious and bleeding with a broken nose, and the other kids scatter. And the White family, is looking at this prostrate, unconscious kid on the ground. And the grandfather says, let's go. Well, Steve, the son, who's the protagonist of this novel, one of the two protagonists of this novel, looks down there and he is experiencing feelings he has never felt in his life. And he just doesn't know what to do with them, but he does know that they can't leave the kid there. And he says so. And so the father looks at the grandfather and the grandfather looks at the father, and they, pause for a minute or two. And then very reluctantly, they open the door of the Buick and pick the kid up by the shoulders and knees and stuff him into the front seat and slam the door. And his head lolls against the windshield and smears it with blood. And they drive him to Mercy Hospital, which is the nearest hospital where blacks can be treated. The other nearest hospital is Michael Reese, where blacks aren't treated, because that's the way it was back in the 40s. And that's where that's the engine of the story. So Steve, the kid, the 10-year-old kid, Steve Feinberg, he goes to school the next day, and his mind is just, he can't concentrate on anything. And when the bell rings at 3:00, he sort of gets up in a trance and stumbles over to Lake Park Avenue and waits for a streetcar and gets on, not having any idea where he's going or how to get there, but just, trusting to the gods. And he asks the conductor what to do, and the conductor tells him what to do. And he gets off at 29th Street and takes a bus east to Mercy Hospital, and by great good luck finds his way to the bedside of the kid, whose name is Jesse Owens Trimble, but he's got a nickname. His nickname is Sass because he's got a smart mouth. And he sits there, and Sass, who's been asleep, wakes up and looks at him and says, what are you doing here? And Steve starts crying and says, I don't know.
Mm-hmm.
And that's where the story begins.
Does Sass remember that Steve is the family he was attacking the previous night?
Gee, that should be an easy question. I'm trying to think whether that's even addressed. I'm going to say provisionally. I'm not sure, but it sort of doesn't matter, because what Sass says to this kid, Sass is 1 year older than him. Sass looks at him and says, I don't know what you're doing here, and I don't want to have anything to do with you. Yeah, he really does. He does know. And he says, go away. But Steve doesn't. And he explains that the reason he's there is because the cops are going to come and arrest Sass, because during the melee in the parking lot, somebody has picked the pocket of his grandfather. And that's how the accident happens. His grandfather feels something fumbling around at the back of his pocket, sort of whirls around and catches Sass by accident rather than the kid who's actually doing the pickpocketing, who turns out to be Sass's bad older brother, Nubby. And so the grandfather doesn't know this, and he says, I'm gonna slap that kid's black ass in jail. So that's, when Steve is at the bedside, he says, my grandfather thinks you picked his pocket and took this silver thing, this talisman that his great grandfather made back in the old country. And if we don't find it, you're going to go to jail. So that kicks off the quest. And they're going all day and all night. And they range all across the city of Chicago, having adventure after adventure, trying to find this missing silver talisman. And they wind up at 3:30 in the morning in the office, Nate's office, in the movie theater that he owns, right in the center of Bronzeville. And in a last-ditch attempt, Sass's mother has the key to the theater because she is a cashier. So they steal her key and let themselves in, and a night watchman finds them and brings them back to their parents. and their parents fall to fighting with one another, and they sneak out and find themselves at the lake looking at the sun coming up and reviewing all the things that they've learned in the 24 hours that they've been together. That's the entire
And
novel.
okay, I thought it was 5.5 days, and then they sort of reconnect in high school in
That's
what,
right. Oh, you read the novel.
6, 7 years. Well, I read up on your author page. I read
All
up on
right.
Amazon,
Now we're
but
talking.
they reconnect, and they don't really know what year is it when they reconnect.
It's 1952. And like I say, racial change has come to Hyde Park. And it's happening slowly, but a lot of white families are fleeing to the northern suburbs. And Steve's family hasn't fled, but they're talking about it. And then a crucial scene in the opening of the novel, his mom and dad, argue about why they, what they're going to do. But when Steve and Sass have parted back in 1948, they don't think they'll ever see one another again because society won't allow that friendship to exist. But here it is 4 years later, and Steve is in the bathroom in Hyde Park High School, and he hears a voice inside a stall, kids smoking. That's what kids do in high school.
In 1952 especially.
and Sass comes out, and they have this reunion, they meet again in the boys' room of Hyde Park High School, and that sets off a second series of adventures.
Okay.
Actually, I've never read this out loud, but I'm thinking maybe I should read that scene between.
Go ahead. Yeah.
Okay.
Is this the reading you had planned?
No, it actually wasn't.
Okay, that's fine.
Don't do it.
That's fine. Go ahead. Yeah.
Don't do it. I can do it or not. All right, I'm just going to take a sip of water before I start.
So I should have sent you a Books and Brews mug to drink from during the program.
Yeah. Well, you still can. All swag gratefully accepted. But let's go on. Let's go on to the third novel. Because I said there was a spoiler that I couldn't tell you about. The two protagonists. Sorry, let me pause and back up. All of these novels are told in first-person voices. The first novel is told in the voice of Steve, the voice of Sass, the voice of Dora, who is a 60-something-year-old Black woman from rural Mississippi with a second-grade education, who is kind of the glue between the two worlds. She is a housekeeper in Steve's apartment. Back then we called them maids, but I don't think that's become a politically incorrect term. And she's also a congregant in the storefront church that is run by Sass's father across street from the movie theater. And the final voice is that of the night watchman, whose name is Joseph, who comes in late in the novel. And Joseph is crazy. He's been sent around.
Literally crazy.
Well, literally off his rocker. Not certifiable, not institutional, but he's obviously not. He's not like the rest of us. And he's the one who discovers the kids in Nate's office. So the second novel is told in 5 voices: Steve's, Sass's, a high school friend named Frederick, Dora, and a character named Mr. Lucky, who is a small-time criminal and jazz saxophonist.
I would like him very much.
You would love Mr. Lucky. I think, honestly, I think Mr. Lucky is maybe, if I'm remembered for anything, maybe it should be Mr. Lucky, because he's a terrific character. And the reason Mr. Lucky is in there is because that bad seed older brother, Nubby has wound up being a numbers runner for Mr. Lucky. And the numbers racket, in case you or your listeners don't know it, numbers racket, also known as policy and other names, was a lottery, an illegal small-time lottery that you could play for pennies. And it flourished in every big city in America, I believe. And it was all run locally. It wasn't, it wasn't the mafia. And it was, it was small-time guys like Mr. Lucky who actually worked for a bigger time guy named Mr. Broughton. But Lucky also is a jazz saxophonist, and music is a big theme in the second novel. Because what did we do in high school? We listened to music. And
Yep.
jazz.
And if we were lucky, we played music.
And if we're lucky, we played music. And Sass does. Sass is a musician. He plays piano and organ and sings, and in church. And he plays the piano in church for the services. But there's a party at the end, toward the end of the second novel, which a high school party, and they call it a zebra party. This was hot stuff back in the mid-50s, because it's blacks and whites.
Okay.
And something happens at this party that plants the seeds for the third novel, and that's what I prefer not to say.
Okay.
But the reason is because who the protagonists are of the third novel. The protagonists are an 11-year-old girl whose nickname is Pinky, who is and I'm going to say something here that I hope your listeners don't find offensive, but it's the easiest way to convey how I sort of view this character. Pinky is a character who looks white but thinks black.
Okay.
And she is being raised by Jolene, but Jolene isn't her mother, and she doesn't know, she doesn't actually know how Jolene got custody of her or what she's doing there. And Jolene's just in it for the money. And the other character is a 23-year-old woman whose name is Molly, who is a reporter for the Associated Press, which, as I said before, I was during this period and covered these riots. And at this point, if you'll indulge me, I would like to read something that I know where it is, and I can read it.
Go ahead. And
that is the beginning of To Do Justice, the third novel.
To Do Justice is
which 3. Is the third novel in the trilogy. And the passage I'm going to read is in Pinky's voice. And Pinky, as I said, Pinky is an 11-year-old girl from a very rundown neighborhood just southwest of the Loop. And I'm not that. So please indulge me. So
did this take some research to write her?
All these novels took research, but I'm going to tell you something, an experience that sounds implausible, but every author has them. And that is that Pinky just she floated down from above and started speaking in my mind.
I fully believe that. I have a character in starting in my second novel. Actually, he's at the end of the first novel, but he's not named. And so when he walks into the second novel, I'm like, "Who are you?" And he's like, "Well, I'm Angus. I'm the cop from the first novel who you never gave a name, but my name is Angus." And I think that
it's magic. It's magic. It's like,
really
it's one of those writerly magic things.
Yeah, I was just curious if you had to do anything to really get into the voice of an 11-year-old, especially growing up in a way that you didn't. And I mean, this is coming from someone who writes medieval warriors, but I think it's interesting to readers how we do this.
Well, I was in a hotel room on the north side of Chicago where I was stuck for 4 days because there was this freak storm and all the airports were closed. And I had a train ticket home, and I wasn't worried about that. But it turns out the trains were closed too because power lines were down on the tracks. And so I was just stuck there in this hotel room and with nothing to do but write a novel. And I had no idea what I was going to do. And I sat down at my laptop, which I conveniently brought with me, and
Mhm.
Picky just floated down and, you know, manifested herself in my mind and started talking.
Right. Diana Gabaldon has a similar story about, I believe it was how Claire came to her. And if you're not familiar with it, or any of my listeners, that's Outlander, which was huge for a long time. And she just heard this person in medieval Scotland talking in a very modern voice. And she's like, "Who are you? Why are you talking like this?" And hopefully I got the story close to straight. But anyway, go ahead with the reading.
Okay. Well, Pinky wasn't the only character who came to me that way. Sass did too. Yeah. Yeah. It's cool. It's just cool. That's the only way. That's the only
Magical, as you
the
say.
only word for it. It is magical. Okay, remember, I'm not an 11-year-old girl. Ever since I'm little, I've been wondering who my mama is. It ain't Jolene. Jolene been raising me, but I ain't her blood. Reminds me of it every chance she gets. Picked me out of a trash pile one day. That's what Jolene says, like a maggot out of a garbage can. If I'm trash, I say, why you done it? Just teasing, she says. You be worth real money. Check for $102.80 on the first of every month. Calls it her pinky check. Long as the welfare keeps sending the pinky check, that's all she cares about, Jolene. Jolene just laughs when I ask about my real mama. One day I'll be finding her, though. See does Jolene laugh when that day comes. Jolene don't treat Bettina no better than me, even though Bettina be flesh and blood to her. Bettina asks who her papa was, but Jolene pretends she don't hear. Poor little thing, Bettina bumping into things like she does. Jolene says Bettina was born with a caul. That's why she's so clumsy. I know better, though. Bettina can't help it. Something wrong inside her head. She plenty smart, all right. Just something inside there don't work how it's supposed to, like a doorbell is busted or a toaster don't pop. All Jolene cares about is the money, though. $102.80 a month for me and $94.73 for Bettina. And Bettina will be worth more soon, Jolene says. Worth as much as you, gal, $102.80 a month when she turns 9. Then in September, when you turn 12, you'll be worth $106.35. And Jolene grins. No wonder Jolene gets so happy when she talks about the money. We're her most valuable property. That's why I got to protect my baby sister best I can. Bettina's my most valuable property. Till I find my real mama, Bettina's the closest thing to kinfolk I got in the world. Should have protected Bettina better than I did, though, the day things got turned upside down.
That's very heartbreaking, and it's especially because it's true. How many times does that happen, even today? Can we back up? How did you get involved in journalism? Was that a lifetime goal, or did you stumble into it?
I did journalism from an early age, kind of. I was on the high school paper, and I always kind of enjoyed it. But this is back then. It wasn't viewed the same way as it is now. It was kind of it's become it became very professionalized, but it wasn't really like that in those days. And journalists didn't had the reputation of not making a whole lot of money. And so I never really considered seriously doing it. And when in college, I was a creative writing major. And when I was 21 years old, I envisioned myself starving in a garret and writing the great American novel.
Right.
And then when I was 22 years old, I kind of envisioned putting breakfast on the table.
I had a relative like that. She had noble goals, and then she decided she liked being able to pay the rent.
Yeah. So here we are in Chicago, and it's not the hot center of the publishing world. New York is, and the first week I'm interviewing for jobs, and I go to publishing houses. Well, there aren't very many publishing houses. I remember I was in Rand McNally, the map maker, which is or was based in Chicago at that time. And I had a very nice interview, And the guy said, you're a fine young man, and come back, and when you get your military service out of the way, and we'll talk. Because at that time there was a draft.
Okay.
And so, I was 22 years old, and I was, prime draft eligible age. So I didn't get any offers. So the second week I decided to look for magazines. Well, Playboy's in Chicago, but there's not much else. and I kept hearing the same thing. You're a nice young man, and come back after your military service is out of the way, and we can talk. So the third week, kind of reluctantly, I decided to start making the rounds of newspapers and daily journalism. And I found myself at City News Bureau of Chicago, which was a storied training ground for cub reporters. And for 109 years, sadly, it no longer exists, but its fame was worldwide as a place where kids who didn't know anything learned kind of how to peek through keyholes, which is literally true. I mean, I had to unlearn some of the things I learned at City News Bureau. I had to unlearn later when I found myself at the AP. But City News Bureau was wonderful. It was, imagine this middle-class, sheltered, white Jewish kid from Hyde Park, and he finds himself hanging out in police stations from 5 in the afternoon till 2 in the morning, and talking to cops and who I'd never talked to. I never exchanged 3 words with a cop up to that point, and here I am, asking them what color their underwear is, and
Seriously.
going out and covering fires, and chasing around town and stuff. And it was just such an adrenaline. It was a daily adrenaline rush. And
So I have to ask you what I asked my son not too long ago. He recently became a cop, and I asked him, so are you getting a partner? Is this anything like what you see on programs on TV, all these series?
Chicago PD.
He said all of those programs look so ridiculous now that I am a cop. So is it the same for being a journalist? And was it the 60s?
Well, there's a lot of hurry up and wait.
There's
a lot of sitting around waiting for the fire, waiting for the fire alarm to go off. But that happens. There's and then you slide down the brass pole and jump on the fire truck. And almost it's exactly like that, particularly when I got to the AP and I was sitting at a desk, and, things would be going along, and I'd be writing about 3-car crashes in Schaumburg, Illinois, and, stuff like that. And all of a sudden the City News teletype starts going ding, 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 ding. And it's all hands on deck.
I have to tell you a funny story, just sort of a side story. I have a former sister-in-law who's a reporter in Ireland. I don't know if she still is, but she was at the time. And somebody I knew online said to me, oh yeah, I was reading this series of articles about this. I think it was a husband who killed his wife or something like that happened in Ireland. I looked it up and I'm like, oh my gosh, my sister-in-law wrote that entire series.
Well,
so it was kind of
the thrill of seeing your byline.
Yeah. It was kind of wild to see this major story, and that's my sister-in-law who's covering that.
Can I tell you a little story?
Yeah.
Before I decided to go to work for the AP, and after I came out of the 6-month plan in the Army and had done what turned out to be 18 months at City News, because I loved it so much. Most people don't last more than 6 months, but I just loved it. And I interviewed at the St. Louis Post-Dispatch, which at that time was one of the great regional papers in America. And the night before, I'm sorry, I was already working for the AP at that point. The night before, I'd written a story, a feature story about some tree huggers in Grant Park who were trying to save, I think, elms, and the city chased them out. And I'm being interviewed by the editor of the St. Louis Post-Dispatch, and he asked me for stuff, And I picked up a copy of the paper before I went there, and my story was on the bottom right of page 1 with my
Uh-huh.
bio. And I said, "Here," and
Here's some
he
quotes.
offered me the job on the spot.
Oh, that's so neat. That's a
Yeah,
great way of getting a job.
I thought long and hard before I took it. The reason I didn't take it mostly was because I didn't really want to be in St. Louis. Although, it's a great paper, but it's not a great news town the way Chicago is or was or
Right.
could be.
Just out of curiosity, what years were you in Chicago or St. Louis?
Well, I I did my Army service at Fort Leonard Wood in the foothills of the Ozarks.
Oh, I've been there. Yeah,
Yeah,
my son graduated from advanced training there, and we had my husband and I had a very, very weird sort of supernatural experience in the woods there. And is it the town Waynesville?
yeah, Waynesville. Yeah,
Yeah.
what a
Yeah.
grubby little town that is.
Uh,
All bars.
There's a really neat antique store there, but we went into the woods and we saw, I felt it, heard it, and my husband saw it. It was very creepy, and I'm still looking for answers as to what it was we
What did you?
experienced. But
Tell me more.
um, we were sitting in the woods, and being from northern Minnesota at the time, as I told you, we're in East Tennessee now, but in northern Minnesota, night falls very slowly. So if it starts
Right.
to get dim, you have maybe an hour, I'm guessing, but you have a long time. And so we had traveled from Duluth down to Fort Leonard Wood for my son's graduation, and we went into these woods, and it was broad daylight. So I was expecting it would, gradually dim over the course of an hour or more. All of a sudden, it's dark in the woods. And we're sitting there by this beautiful little pond in this glade where people go scuba diving into underground caverns. And I heard a step behind me, like the size of an elk or a large grown man.
Wow.
And I turned and I saw nothing, but I just got this feeling and I said, we need to go. And we started going, and you have to walk around this walkway, this wooden boardwalk around the top of the pond to get to the other side. We got to the other side, and my husband looked back and he said he saw something the size of a large full grown man, except it was like a head, kind of shoulders and down. So he said it was sort of like a bowling pin shape, but sort of like a man, but just totally inky black and like just malevolent. And we were that close. He was almost dragging me out of there. And I will just say he was an Eagle Scout. He spent a long time or lots of time in the woods camping in every season in the dark. He would walk through our 29 acres in Duluth in the pitch black without a flashlight. He is not scared of the dark or the woods. And whatever he saw, he was nearly dragging me out like we need to get away from here. So yes, I'm familiar with Fort Leonard Wood, and that was my
Well,
experience.
it's hard to say that was a hallucination if you both saw it.
I didn't see it, but I certainly felt it and heard it.
Yeah.
And I
Your
don't
own
doubt
your own Bigfoot experience.
it was weird. But back to the violence of the cities. Can you give me some history of the political violence before the cities? I'm sorry, before the 60s, because I think a lot of us, especially who didn't live those years, think of the 60s being the explosion of violence.
It was, but it certainly wasn't the only one. There was a terrible, I mean, the press continued to refer to the riots on the West Side that I covered as race riots, but they were not race riots, not in the same sense. They were property riots, really. They were outcries against, the inability to own one's home and the crappy services and terrible stores, lack of fresh fruits and vegetables and what have you that happen, inside inner city neighborhoods where merchants don't want to serve the public
Mhm.
inside these neighborhoods. Um, but Chicago had a terrible race riot, an actual race riot in 1919, where white gangs, went up State Street, you know, picking black people at random and clubbing them and beating them,
Oh,
stuff like
yeah.
that. It was terrible. It was
Mhm.
you know, it's kind of forgotten by history, but it happened.
I've never heard of that.
Yeah, no, it happened.
I've certainly heard of plenty of other violence before the 60s, which I think is less known, but I've never heard of that one.
Yeah, yeah. No, but what happened in the 60s was really new for America. And Chicago
Mhm.
was not the worst of it, but Chicago, we had our share. And I wrote about what happened in Chicago because I covered what happened in Chicago.
Mhm.
But gee, Newark, Watts, um, uh, you know, there were a lot of explosions across America that were um, don't know what the word is, but you know, worse, better, you know, bigger, whatever. Um, uh, but you know, I sort of don't want America to forget what happened in Chicago
Right.
in the summers of 65 and 66.
I think
66.
that's important. What
Yeah.
what what was it exactly that sparked the 1967 riot?
Well, I'll tell you, because again, you know, I'm back there in the AP office. It's 1964. Let me see, 65. Um, and it's that quiet night that I described, and nothing's happening. And the City News Bureau ticker starts, you know, going off, and the bells start ringing, and somebody rips the copy off the teletype machine, and it says, you know, bulletin, rioting is reported on Roosevelt Road or Taylor Street or whatever it is, you know, southwest of the Loop, and looting is reported. And I remember, I'll never forget the sick feeling in the pit of my stomach, you know, this just cold feeling in the pit of my stomach, which I felt because naive, you know, still pretty wet behind the ears me couldn't imagine the idea looting in my hometown, looting. Well,
Mhm.
let me tell you, I went out, you know, they sent me out, and I went out in the street, and boy, I saw my share of looting. And you know
Mhm.
what happens during these riots, and I saw this pattern repeated again and again every time. You know, at first, there's this joy on the streets. People are out there, and they're kicking in store windows, and they're taking what they want, and they're running out, and the cops are coming up to them, and they're basically going up in the cop's face and telling him, try and do something and everything. And they've got armloads of loot, and they're just having a great time. And sociologists who studied this came to call this the carnival effect, which I think is
Mhm.
a very apt description of it. And it happens on the first night. The second night, it doesn't happen so much. And the third night, things get really grim. And the fourth night, it peters out. And that's really the pattern that most of these explosions follow. And I,
Okay.
what I've just described, what actually happens, I've fictionalized in my novels the whole process at some length because I experienced,
Mhm.
a lot.
With with this carnival effect, does it start off with this, joy and carnival feeling because they all think nobody's going to get hurt or they personally won't get hurt? Do they
Well,
not?
I can't say what they think, but what they
Mhm.
see is, they go out in the street and all hell's breaking loose, and
Mhm.
they see their fellow man, kicking in store windows and grabbing power tools and and running around, you know, running around with piles of stuff in their arms, and they do it too. Um, I covered the Detroit riot in 1967 when I was working for the AP. They named me to what they called the AP Racial Task Force.
So
And
were you out in the middle of it?
yeah, you bet I was. Yeah.
Okay. And what was going
Detroit
through your head
riot
at
was,
the
in
time?
terms of lives lost, it was the worst. It was the worst thing that happened in the 60s. 37 people died. Um, and so what they did was they put me on a plane to Detroit, and I got there a little after midnight, and I could see the fires, from the plane as we were landing. And I went to the hotel that they booked for me, and I got a few hours sleep, and I reported to the bureau the next morning. And they gave me a rental car, and I drove, and they said, go to 12th Street, which is where the rioting happened. That was the epicenter of the riot.
Mhm.
So I'm in this rental car, and I'm driving up there, and it's 9 a.m, and the cops, for some reason, are letting cars through.
Mhm.
And so anybody who wants to can just drive up 12th Street at 2 miles an hour and look at the storefronts that have been stove in, and the hand painted signs that say Soul Brother on some of the windows, which doesn't help at all. Those those stores are just as looted, in the storefronts just as smashed.
And I take it the signs were there to say this is a Black-owned business.
Yeah,
Leave me
Black-owned
alone.
business. It made no difference. As far as I could see, it made no difference whatsoever. And smoke is still coming out, and there's trash all over the streets, and cars are winding up, just northbound, single file, and the cops are out in the street kind of directing traffic. So I'm going up here, and I'm witnessing all this, and I get to the end of it, and I pull off on a side street, and I park the car, and I grab my pen and my pad, not having a single idea what I'm going to do. I just no idea what I'm going to do, except get out of the car and walk back toward the riot zone. So I do
Mhm.
that, and I start walking, and a person. This is a Black neighborhood. A Black person, a neighbor resident of the neighborhood, says something to me, and I, stop and say something to that person, and we fall into conversation, and we start drawing a crowd, and pretty soon there are like 20 people around me, and guess what they want to do? They want to tell
I
their
don't know.
they want to tell their story.
Okay. Okay.
That's what they want to do. I am the first representative of the outside world that these people have seen. Uh,
Mhm.
and I've got a pen and a pad and access to every newspaper and broadcast station in around the world, because I work for the Associated Press. And they, probably some of them can't believe their good luck in that they've got somebody like me who they can talk to. And I just wrote down everything I heard as fast as I.
What kind of stories were they telling you? Were they explaining why they
They,
want to
they,
riot or?
that is exactly what they were doing.
Okay.
Yep, that is exactly what they were doing. They were explaining, their side of the story, and how,
And what was their side of the story?
well, how crappy conditions are, and why, why, they expressed various ideas about why this was happening, and whether they participated. And of course, people were reluctant to say that. And this is a scene in one of the novels too, because I'm kind of like a magpie. I pick and choose among my various experiences in various
Right.
cities. And this happened in Detroit, which I'd never been in my life. This is the first time I'd ever set foot in Detroit, and I am now
Have you
married.
ever been back?
I've been back because I'm now
Okay.
married to a woman who grew up in Dearborn, just adjacent to
Oh,
the southern
interesting.
border,
Okay.
and I've been back plenty of times. But at that
Mhm.
time, this was the first time I'd ever set foot in Detroit.
So did you ask them or did they give any explanation? How is destroying your neighborhood going to improve conditions?
My character asks that question in
Okay.
the fictionalization of this thing, and says to herself, don't they realize that they're destroying their food shops and restaurants and things
Right.
like that, and where are they going to get breakfast in the morning?
Right. Now, I'll tell you something connected to that. I lived in Brooklyn Park, Minnesota, when the
Oh,
George
Brooklyn Park.
Floyd riots were happening.
Yeah, sure.
Brooklyn Park, for better or worse, has been in the news a few times. Okay,
Yeah.
it's always for bad reasons, never good
Nice town.
reasons.
I had a
It
girlfriend
used to
who
be.
grew up in Anoka.
Okay, yeah, I know Anoka well. My sister lived there. And so my co-host at the time actually lived a mile from the epicenter of the George Floyd riots. And he did we did an interview the next morning by Zoom, and he was almost shaking. He was saying, I could hear it, I could see it, and I could smell it all night long. And I'm not sure he had slept. But, later on the news, I had come across a church who was taking food into Minneapolis. My daughter had a friend who had to leave her apartment in Uptown because they had no water for weeks on end. So she moved back with her dad. Um, and I was donating money to this church where they were gathering, not money, food, I'm sorry. They were gathering all this food and diapers and everything and taking it into Minneapolis because people there had no shops, they had no buses, they had nothing. And I can remember a Black woman on the news just about in tears saying, hey, what do you think you're doing? You're only hurting the people you claim to be helping, because I'm Black and I have no grocery store. I have no bus to get there. Even if I did, I'm entirely dependent on people from the suburbs driving food in. We
Well,
have nowhere to go to buy food.
that question is being asked of the people who are euphoric from, experiencing this sudden license to do whatever they want and
Right.
grab whatever they want and have a good time and high five their buddies out there on the street
And what is their answer?
and give the cops the finger. I don't think what I'm trying to say by euphoria is they're not thinking that way.
Okay.
You know,
They're just not thinking,
the
period.
consequences don't start sinking in until they need to buy a loaf of bread.
Yeah. Now, going back to writing, how is the change from journalism to fiction? For some people, I think it's easy, just any kind of writing at all. For some people, there's a very clear difference between the two
It
styles.
wasn't hard for me because I was, like I said, I was a creative writing major in college.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, heck, I was a reluctant journalist, although I have to say I don't regret a minute of my life in journalism, and I consider myself working press the first half of my career, and then I became a publisher and an editor, and I discovered I had a talent for writing direct marketing copy, what we impolitely call junk mail, and so I started doing client work and stuff like that, and only started writing these novels, kind of when that phase of my life was near an end.
Okay.
But I know that a lot of journalists just can't do it. They can't. My
Right.
best friend who used to work for the Milwaukee Journal Sentinel, and he, he was a wonderful writer. He's a terrific writer, but he was such a person. He sort of, he would say, I don't know how you do it. He said, he did write fanciful stuff, but to hold it together and write coherently in 70,000 words of a novel, I mean,
Right.
He couldn't understand how anybody
Well,
could do it.
70,000 is way different from, a 1,000-word article or however
Right.
long. So how did you end up being an editor at the Washington Post during Watergate? Or how did you end up being an editor? And tell me about Watergate.
Well, you could say I was lucky, but I don't think of those years as being particularly lucky years. I really was lucky. I left Chicago in 1969. Before that, I had left journalism. I'd left the AP. I was doing pretty darn well at the AP. When I left the AP, I was night city editor of the Chicago Bureau, which is a major bureau, and I was on the AP Racial Task Force, and I covered some terrific stories, but that experience of seeing the carnival effect, which I didn't have words for at the time, my experience out there on the street watching these things happen and then having to go back to the office and write 350 words straight down the middle, unbiased 350 words that told the whole story for the A-Wire, for newspapers and broadcast stations all around the world, and I was experiencing cognitive dissonance. I couldn't do it. I wasn't sure what I was seeing myself, let alone, feeling like I was doing justice to it, in my copy. And at the time, which was 1967, right in the middle of the most, most fraught time of the 60s, I had a girlfriend, the one who was from Anoka, Minnesota, who I was deeply in love with. And she was a political radical and a feminist, an early feminist. And she was filling my head, full of ideas that were new to me. And she was a graduate student at the University of Illinois in economics, going for a PhD in economics. And one thing led to another, and I decided that, I would leave journalism and spend the rest of my life writing about the riots as a professor, as an academic. So I applied to the University of Chicago and the University of Wisconsin and University of Illinois, and I got into all three. And Chicago was the best school, and I got a few bucks, for at least what turned out to just be the first semester. So I went to the University of Chicago, signed up, left the AP, and enrolled in the PhD program in political sociology, and quickly was disabused of my fantasies. What I discovered, I thought I was bringing something to the University of Chicago community. I'd had all this street experience. I'd, witnessed this stuff. And what I discovered was, if it didn't happen in a book, it didn't happen.
I'm not really surprised by that. I think that can be a huge flaw of people in ivory towers.
Yeah.
Well,
that particularly at a place like Chicago, which is a very theoretical place.
Yeah, they have their ideas about how life should be and how it really is lived by those down below.
Yeah. And I was 27. I'd been out of school for 5 years, and I had forgotten how hard it is. And it's twice as hard in graduate school, where you got to read, an entire Talcott Parsons book in a minute or something like that. I don't know if you ever had the experience of making the acquaintance of Mr. Parsons, but boy, I'll tell you something. If there ever was a man who didn't know how to construct an English sentence, it is Talcott Parsons.
I'm not familiar with him.
He is revered. He is revered by political sociologists the world over, or was then, probably because they couldn't understand him, so they probably figured he was brilliant.
Right. Isn't that how it goes?
I couldn't understand him, and
just saying he doesn't know what he's talking about. If he did, it would make sense to me.
Right. So I was in a total panic my first quarter, and because I was in a total panic, possibly, I did great. I got all A's, including in a course that, by reputation, nobody got an A in. And at the end of the quarter, the relationship broke up. It was winter in the Midway, and boy, if you've ever been on the Midway, it's a bad place to be in winter. It is bleak. And as they say about the University of Chicago, it's where fun goes to die. And I didn't know anybody, and I didn't have any friends, and this relationship had broken up, and I'd left the news business, which I loved. And I was, on a path that wasn't going well at all. And I fell into a deep depression and stumbled through the rest of the coursework for the master's degree over 2 years or so, 2 of the unhappiest years of my life. And at the end of it, I said, I got to get back into journalism. Well, I came to Washington toward the end there to do research for my master's paper, which would be on the riots. And my research consisted of going to the National Archives and looking through the documents of the Kerner Commission, which had investigated all the riots all around the country. And the records had been, sealed and put in the National Archives, and had been unsealed the week before I got there. And as it happens, I was the first outsider ever to see those stuff. So I spent, 3 weeks in the bowels of the National Archives, going through box after box after box of stuff, doing the research on my master's paper. And at night, we would go out and party. I was staying with a guy I worked was at the AP in Chicago, who now worked for the Washington Bureau. And, we'd party every night. We'd go out there and we'd meet these Capitol Hill people and talk politics and talk Washington. And Washington's a beautiful city, by the way, in fall.
I
don't know whether
actually,
you realize it because it gets such a bad press, but it is a
well, no, I
beautiful
lived
city.
in Fairfax, Virginia for 3 years, and my parents took us into DC almost every Sunday for 3 years.
Yeah.
And then my high school band went back there on,
Of
we
course it
marched in. Yeah, I think I'm assuming it was the 4th of July parade we marched in DC. So I know DC fairly well. In
Right.
fact, my band took off. We were in the basement of Ford Theater. And this was brand new to most people from Minnesota, but I had been there so many times. I'd even seen a play in Ford's Theater. Christmas Carol is what we saw. And the band left, and somehow I got left behind. And it was lucky it was me, because I'd been in DC so often. I knew they were going, I think it was to the Treasury or something like that, something to do with money. I think it was the Treasury. And I was like, yep, I know where that is. So I just walked down the street by myself and found them. So yes, it is a beautiful city and some amazing monuments and memorials. And my husband actually spends a fair amount of time there for his work now too. So,
Well, you should be here right now when the crab apples are in full bloom and the red buds are just coming in. And man,
the cherry trees.
it is really pretty right now.
Yes. Yes, early April. I remember we had one of those beautiful, I forget if it's called a dogwood or if it was a cherry tree, but the ones that just all white.
The dogwoods and the azaleas are next. Yep.
Yep. I can remember walking down the streets of DC with all those trees just all white and bloom, and it is gorgeous.
Yeah. And fall is even in ways even more gorgeous because the colors come out and it's just breathtaking.
Mm-hmm.
And unlike Chicago, which doesn't have any season except a little bit of summer, we've got this 3-month-long spring and this 3-month-long fall, and they are beautiful seasons. Winter is just rainy and overcast and kind of horrible and depressing, and summer is hotter than hell. But spring and fall are really nice seasons here.
Right.
Yeah.
So was it through these friends that you ended up working for the Washington Post?
Well, I'm sorry. I'm digressing again. I have bad habit of doing that. When I got back to Chicago after doing this research, I knew this is where I had to be. And I systematically started trying to get a job here. And I scheduled, a week of interviews. I think I interviewed about 17 places. And I think I got 17 job offers or 16.
Nice.
No, I got probably about 15 job offers because the 2 I wanted, I didn't get. And it was an extraordinary time. It was 1968, 9, something like that. Was the early days of the Great Society. Washington was booming, and they needed people. And here I was, a depressed University of Chicago grad student, but they don't know because I looked great on paper. I was Night City editor of the Chicago Bureau of the AP, and I, about to get my master's degree in political sociology from one of the, best universities in America. And, they don't know that I'm a depressed mess. So, so every place I interviewed, I got job offers except the Post, which I really wanted, and National Journal, which was just starting up, and my congressman, Abner Mikva, who, that would have been a political job. The other 2 would have been journalism jobs. And I kept calling and I kept calling, and I never was offered the Washington Post at that time, but eventually I did get offered both of the other 2, and I had to choose whether I wanted to go to work for National Journal or go to work for Ab Mikva. And it was a hard one. It was a hard choice, but I made the choice to go, with journalism and National Journal. And then, a lot of things happened, but it was a great place to work. It was a great place in a lot of ways. It was just starting up, prototype -3. So I was in from the ground floor. And my signal achievement in the 8 or 9 months that I was there was to cover passage, pretty much the entire passage of the Postal Reform Act that created the U.S. Postal Service.
Wow.
Which isn't, in the scheme of things, but it was a thing. It was definitely a thing. And
It has to be a major change, though. I mean, I don't even know what the change was.
Well, I learned a lot about postal affairs.
I
I
bet.
really did. And, I couldn't even spell post office before, I started covering it. But that's the way it is, when you're a journalist. What I found, I found that, the first week you don't know what you're doing. 6 months later, you're an expert and everybody's asking you what's going on. So, I've experienced that pattern over and over again. It was not until a year and a half or 2 years later, when I'd taken another job, which was a very ill-fated thing that I wish I had never taken, and it was an awful year, that I got offered the job at the Post. The reason being, I was working for a guy who had a $50,000 grant from the 20th Century Fund to write a critical analysis of the news services and the wire services and the broadcast networks, which was a really ill-starred, ill-fated project that never got published, and deservedly so, I might say. But in the course
did you actually write all of that?
I wrote half of it. I wrote half of the manuscript, but that never got published. And my job was, the wire services, because I'd worked for the wire services. And one of those was the Los Angeles Times Washington Post News Service. And so, of course, I knew, the guy who ran it, whose name was Bob Keith. And at the end of the news study, he offered me a job. And that's how I came in the back door of the Washington Post. So I was an editor in the LA Times Washington Post News Service from 71 to 75, which was the height of Watergate. And everything exciting was happening, but around me, but not to me. And I was an editor in this backwater of the Post, but I was about, maybe number 17 of the 30 or 40 editors who handled Woodward and Bernstein's copy.
So did you end up meeting some of these people involved?
Sure. Oh, sure. Funny story. They were filming All the President's Men back then, and they were filming it on location. And Bob Woodward and Dustin Hoffman were in the newsroom a lot. And I remember when Dustin Hoffman, when Robert Redford would come in the newsroom, you knew he was there because there was this cluster of women circling around. You couldn't even see him, But one time, I was walking through the newsroom and I was walking toward the back of this, walked past Carl's desk, and somebody was sitting in Carl's chair with his feet up on Carl's typewriter, who I thought was Carl, until I walked past him and realized it was Dustin Hoffman.
Oh, funny. So was he just relaxing, or was he?
I didn't stop to ask. I didn't stop to ask.
Okay.
But he wasn't drawing a crowd like Redford.
He didn't have the star quality looks. He played
right. He was there for a different reason, but
right,
very important reason.
So did you meet Woodward and Bernstein?
Oh, sure. I mean, yeah, sure. I worked in the newsroom. I met them. Sure. Yeah.
And what was your impression of them?
I didn't have that much of an impression with them. I didn't have much contact with them. Carl was, he was kind of a slovenly looking guy. Whereas Woodward was the opposite. He was very trim, former naval officer, and always pressed shirts and things like that. So they were quite a contrast with one another. And it's kind of funny that they worked well together because they came from very different backgrounds. But boy, did they ever work well together. They worked, they produced some fantastic journalism.
Did they work on projects other than Watergate together?
They were put together by Ben Bradley because of Watergate. There was this break-in at the Watergate, and a night watchman, discovered it, and it sort of came over, the police wires being, kind of another routine thing. But I guess Bradley picked up on the fact that it wasn't. And because it happened in the city, he needed Metro reporters because that's how it worked. And both Woodward and Bernstein were on the Metro staff. So he said, all right, you two, go out and find out what happened at the Watergate. And that's how it started. I don't think there was any other history to it at all.
Okay, so they just kind of ended up together. I
Yeah.
was reading some interesting things about them, a few months ago that made it sound like there was more to the story than just, these reporters who happened to cover it. That's all I'll say because I don't remember the details, but it makes me curious to look back into that now and see
Well, there's
about
a
that.
lot written about it. There's no dearth of information about that.
Right, right. So what was your impression of Watergate? I mean, I know in history it's come down as Nixon evil.
I felt very much like it was reflected glory, but as a Washington Post staffer, it was really nice to be in the shadow of the reflected glory. But my job at the AP at the news service was exactly the same work that I'd done, among other things, when I was at the AP 5 years earlier, and it's called filing a wire, which means selecting stories and editing stories to put on a wire for redistribution to other media who were subscribers and members of the service. So when I left the AP, I said, well, at least I'll never file a wire again. And then here I was at the Post
filing wires,
filing a wire again, and it is the most soul-deadening, boring work a journalist can do. I love being a reporter. I'm a pretty damn good editor, but it isn't my favorite thing to do. I mean, really, I've been an editor on a lot, and I really am. I'm a pretty good editor, but it was a lot more fun being a reporter. But here I was. There was no opportunity to be a reporter when you work in the job that I was working. And I remember one night, I was working the night shift, and the other guy who was working with me, a guy named Jim Yankel, lovely guy, we were sitting across the desk from one another, and you were talking like, do you think there'll be anything else in our lives, or our lives? I mean, I was 30 years old, 31 years old. I said, do you think there'll be anything else in our lives after this? And, and both of us were just like despondent, because we knew we were working in a backwater of the Washington Post, even though it was Watergate days. And I just wanted to get out of there. And for a while, I really tried hard, and I started freelancing for different sections of the paper. I wrote the lead piece in the Sunday business section on American Express, a profile of American Express. And then for the section called Outlook, which was kind of news analysis and opinion, it doesn't exist anymore, but it was a great section. I wrote the lead piece about my wife's hometown, Dearborn, Michigan, which was a fascinating story. And I went to the editor at the time, Mary Lou Beatty, and I sold it to her, and I said, this is a great story, and I'm the guy to write it, because I'm married to a woman from Dearborn, and I know exactly what's happening. What was, to summarize quickly, Dearborn is the home of the Ford Motor Company, and at the time, the mayor was a guy named Orville Hubbard, who'd been mayor for 32 years, and the way he perpetuated his success was to get the Ford Motor Company to pay all the money so people didn't pay taxes to speak of, and keep blacks out.
Oh.
Yeah. And this is, on the southern rim of Detroit, which was, all black at that point, I think pretty close. And, Orville Hubbard stemmed the tide for 32 years, but somewhere around the end of it, he had a stroke, and he was in a wheelchair, and he was, pretty much couldn't talk, he's in a wheelchair, and his common law wife, his girlfriend, Maureen, what was her last name, was in effect running the town, and 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 um, and it was just this great story, and that was the story I wrote about.
Okay.
But
All
I
these
profiled
fascinating
Dearborn.
details of history that are forgotten. I have to ask you, having lived through the time, I I was alive during the time of Watergate, but not that I remember any of it. And I was surprised to learn a few years ago, probably less than that, that Nixon was actually an extremely popular and well-liked president
He was
before
in effect,
Watergate.
yeah, he was.
So what was your opinion? Like, how quickly did it change, or how quickly did people's opinions change about him?
Well, Nixon was an interesting figure. I hated Nixon. I'll confess that I hated Nixon, but but he was a very smart politician, and particularly in the early part of his presidency, he he was a Republican, but he really didn't behave like a Republican when the chips were down. He was his record, his policy record was actually rather liberal, and
Hmm.
he did a lot of things, that would today would be associated more with liberals than with conservatives, and and uh, and he was quite a successful president at first.
Hmm.
Yeah, is that the question
So
or something else?
more or less, yeah. What do you think that you will write novels set around Watergate, like you did around the Chicago riots?
No, I never crossed my mind.
Okay.
Never crossed my mind. But I am in the middle of writing a novel, which is a complete departure. Um, I like to call it dystopian satire, but my writing group, who have read pieces of it, say, "Oh, come on, Frank, this is science fiction." So,
Hmm.
and it's
Complete departure then.
complete departure, and it's the most fun of anything I have ever written. And I find myself laughing, just I'll write something and it's just that's you crack me up,
I
buddy.
crack myself up. Something like that.
It is
That's
more fun
great.
to write this novel, honestly.
Yeah, I've gone from medieval time travel to writing kind of noir-inspired mysteries and a memoir about our change of life from suburbs to a farm. So I had to get cleaned up today. I think I might have mentioned to you, I spend usually up till about 1 or 2, I might be working out on the farm, scooping poop out of the sheep shed. I'm tongue-tied, things like that. And then my hair is all plastered down from having a hat, and I'm a mess. And it's like, oh, now I got to run and take a shower and hope the hair dries. So, where can people find you online?
Uh, frankjoseph.com. Easiest thing in the
Okay.
world.
Okay.
www.frankjoseph.com. The novels are To Do Justice, To Walk Humbly, and To Love Mercy. You can buy them everywhere and anywhere. You can get them on Amazon. You can get them on barnesandnoble.com. You can get them from your local independent bookstore. They probably don't have them on the shelves, but they can order
They
them.
can order them. Yeah.
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 And
Anything that's on Amazon can be
sure,
ordered.
you can find out more on the website, but or you can send me an email at frank@frankjoseph.com and buy a copy from me, and I will autograph it if that matters to you. But that's basically the story. You can get them anywhere.
All right. So I'm going to start telling people I don't have my tavern behind me now, as you can see, but normally I have my tavern behind me, and the price of admission to my tavern is you have to hit subscribe and like. It doesn't cost you money, but it's not free. So I sort of stole that from another YouTuber. You can find me at booksandbrews.net. You can find my books at lauravosica.com. You can find our sponsor at Gabriel Sworn Press. And you can find all those sheep who leave so much poop for me to clean up at glenmerrillfarms.wordpress.com. So we have coming up, we actually have quite a number of people lined up, both for Books and Brews full podcast and for Books and Brews Light. So some of them, and this is only some of them, we have Laura Cradle, who writes horror, J.K. Divya, who writes dark fantasy, mythological horror, and paranormal. We have Barry Black, who is a former FBI master bomb technician, so that's going to be an explosive interview. In July, we have Randy Lurch, who is a former Major League Baseball player, with his book, God in the Bullpen. And September, we have Charles Graham, who writes sci-fi based on his life in the military and I believe 20 years flying search and rescue that he has all woven into sci-fi. So that should be interesting. All of them should be interesting. So thank you very much for being on the program. Cheers.